All right. Welcome to the International Association of Political Consultants, our second track of individual panelists. Today, the panel title is Election Tactics and Strategies in a Time of Pandemic, something none of us probably thought we would ever have to be discussing. But after this year, we are all experts by choice or not. Moderator for this panel is Matt Klink from California. He is an IAPC board member, so thank you for your service on the board. Matt comes from a background of 25 years of experience working on complex and controversial high-profile issues, which are obviously a lot more fun than the boring, low-profile issues in the public and private sector. He's worked on numerous candidate and ballot measure campaigns. He's been involved with initiative campaigns at multiple levels of government. He's handled everything in campaigns from general consulting, campaign management, media, spokesperson, direct mail design and production, and even coalition building. He's an award-winning writer who's developed effective messaging and captivating copy. He's appeared on a lot of television shows, especially recently, both national and local news broadcasts. He's even served in a senior level position of Director of Government Affairs for Philip Morris International based in Switzerland, making him an international man of mystery. There he handled outreach programs on regulatory and fiscal issues in more than 35 countries and 6 continents. Also been a communication consultant to American Honda Motor Company. Worked in congressional races, Virginia House of Delegates, which are coming up again next year, has a master's in political management from the George Washington University and a bachelor's from the University of California at Berkeley, and somehow squeaked out being a conservative after that. He serves on the board of directors, as I mentioned, for the IAPC. And so, Matt, we thank you for leading this panel for us today.
Thanks, Brent. I appreciate that very lengthy and kind introduction. I often joke that I like to work on initiatives because they don't call the House at 10:30 at night like candidates do. But that being said, our topic today is the COVID-19 pandemic and how it influenced strategies and tactics for this election cycle. We've got a panel of experts that I think are going to offer some really insightful comments. So, just let me frame this up, and then what I'll go through is I'll introduce our first panelist, Ashlee, and she can then offer her comments, and then we'll just go bang, 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 one after the other. But, just looking at the numbers, I mean, even today, 10.1 million cases in the United States, 238,000 deaths, with the curve doing anything but flattening. In fact, with the anticipated flu season, it looks to be getting worse, although counterbalance that with the announcement today from Pfizer that sent the stock market soaring, which was a good thing. Let's hope that their vaccine, which is allegedly proven to be 90% effective, will be so. But from our construct, what we really care about is how did it change what we as professionals did in the most recently concluded election. So to offer their insights, we have 3 just incredible, accomplished panelists. Our first panelist is Ashlee Stephenson, Vice President and National Political Director of Public Affairs and Federation Relations for the United States Chamber of Commerce. She's involved with voter education. She's got a lot of experience as a political strategist and a pollster. Would love to hear Ashlee's thoughts on polling as well. And she has done this on behalf of both public affairs and corporate interests, as well as the political side of the equation. I won't read her full bio because it's longer and way more esteemed than mine, but I urge you to look at it in the program. That being said, Ashlee, I would love to hear your thoughts on how COVID changed the political campaign season, both from a strategic and a tactical level.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Matt, for the invitation to join all of you today. And it's a real honor to be on this panel with true experts in this space. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what Carlos and Dan have to share. I know we're all going to learn a lot. And I start off by saying that of all the election cycles we all have worked through, combined and in our lifetimes, 2020 has been like anything any of us have ever seen before. And I think we probably all collectively went into 2020 knowing that it was going to be a bit different than normal. Money, dollars raised and spent in politics was going to break records. Turnout was going to be off the charts. And then at the start of the year, or rather early in, somewhere around February, became crystal clear that the coronavirus pandemic was going to upend pretty much all of what we were planning for, probably collectively, from a messaging strategy to just the calendars that we all maintain, whether it's to raise money, send candidates out on the road, to some of the events we engage in from a US chamber level. So when I give briefings to our members, several of them a day, my very first slide is the start of 2020 to where we are today. And it's really normal in politics for a couple of weeks in the US to be like a lifetime of most of us, what we're used to from just a messaging cycle and that sort of thing. But when you look at the beginning of the year, the issues that voters cared about, we had 5 or 6 things bubbling to the surface of what we call an issue matrix in polling. Those things ranged from, of course, the evergreen top concerns of jobs in the economy and healthcare, and some second tier issues were on top of minds of voters. Now, keep in mind, at the start of the year, we were still going through a hotly contested Democratic presidential primary, where a lot of those issues were brought to the forefront. But we were talking about things with our members from an issue advocacy standpoint, like education and climate, and a number of other issues that normally in an election season were focused on 2 things. And lately, it's been jobs in the economy, always an evergreen top of mind issue, and healthcare over the last several election cycles. We saw quickly that as the coronavirus took hold of this nation and really stopped everything in its tracks politically, this election was going to come down to 2 major issues: who was delivering for their constituents through the coronavirus pandemic and had the best solutions for their constituents or would-be constituents if elected, to not only keep people healthy and improve the healthcare climate, but also jobs in the economy. It was a constant battle with those 2 issues at the very top. Beyond that, the processes that we take part in cycle to cycle, like endorsement events physically, where we travel out across the country specifically for those Senate candidates we endorsed, with this being such a big year, we were no longer able to hold those in person. And I will tell you, and I know we're going to get to this a bit later, just how did the cadence of our own political lives get disrupted. I had more calls with candidates during those first 6 to 8 weeks when campaign was really driven to a complete halt than at any point from a condensed time during the rest of the cycle. So it was really inspiring, frankly, to watch my peers, whether it be across the aisle and from a nonpartisan view, to really pick themselves up and figure out the new normal, how to operate within that and break records when it came to fundraising, of course, turnout. And then lastly, I'd close, and I bet we talk about this more, identifying the voters who were going to participate in this expanded absentee and early voting process that we had across the country that really shifted everything that most of us know because of the pandemic. So it was a lot of changing plans on the fly, but again, very inspirational. I know we're going to hear about that more from the other panelists, what organizations and campaigns did to keep up with this, and so many of them finding their way to real success.
Inevitably, one person always puts themselves on mute during the call and forgets to take themselves off. Let's hope that I am that person. Our second speaker is Carlos Gutierrez. He is a consultant who works in both Mexico and Spain, and he works on digital strategies. I think that Carlos will offer some insight into what campaigns are doing outside of America. And most particularly, Carlos, I'd love to hear your take on the recently concluded presidential election in the Dominican Republic, where I believe you were involved. So I think that's a really good, Americans, we tend to focus on what happened within the confines of the United States. But there are a lot of elections around the world that are equally important and just as earth-shattering as the American presidential election. So we'd love to get your take on how the pandemic, at least on a macro level, then we can probe deeper, influenced what you do.
Thank you, Matt, for the introduction. You say the election tactics and strategies in a time of pandemic. If we think about that, first of all, thank you, Mauricio Bengochea and EAPC, for inviting me to be part of this conference. 2020 was an atypical year for the pandemic. The main points for me in the political digital campaign are objective, your screen. Here is where the game is being played. In this time where people are at home, we need to get the attention of the audience. Now, our main competitors are also the parents, daughter and sons, your neighbors. Always you are competing the attention with the people who live with the voter. So we must find the power to catch the attention and engage through the screens with quality content. Win the screen, win the election. Innovate your zone. This year, the campaign was Zoom after Zoom with different audience. There weren't events in the street, meetings, caravanas with the passion and the happiness of the voters in the events. So how to connect with the audience? How to make the content different when the events are always almost the same, Zoom after Zoom? You must innovate in your content and in the way you share the main message of your events to connect with the audience. Also, you must help your followers and community to get used to virtual meetings. I really admire the grandparents who learn how to use the technology to talk with their families. So this learning we can use too in the campaign. So another point, don't swipe. That was one of the things we need to achieve. In this time where people don't pay attention, you need to make things to catch it. You have 3 seconds or less to get it before they swipe. So you must try to avoid that they swipe up your content. Other important point, listen the heart. Listen the heart. Analyze, analyze, and analyze. It was really difficult to understand the audience last month. The resentment accumulated, the disaffection of the citizen, the anger caused the pandemic. To understand the behavior of the citizen, we need to get into their lives. What are their feelings, their worries, and find a way to connect with them. The party or candidate that hack the feelings and throws of the voters will win. Other important point, data, data, and data. Data mining, small data, learn more about the behavior of the audience. We will spend a lot of time investigating, trying to analyze the real behavior of the audience. We need to learn, we need to decipher about their routines, their likes and dislikes, the digital behavior. Give precision shots to each of audience based on their needs, on their demands through data. So if you have all this information, all this data really organized and the real interpretation of that, you need to create a specific content to connect with them. Always having in mind the citizen as the center of everything. The citizen must be the center of everything. So the candidate as part of the community through the content. Programmatic ads. Use technology. Invest in platforms with artificial intelligence. Do micro-targeting to reach all audience. Create a specific content for each segment. Try to influence in voters' decision. You really need to invest in programmatic ads. It is important. I think that today we cannot imagine without programmatic. Or other of the main points was citizen first. Citizens at the center of the campaigns. We did it in the Dominican Republic presidential campaign. But the citizen first. It's people's time. First, their needs and demands. Get the trust and engagement. If you act like a politician doing politics, it's not going to work with the citizens nowadays. Other point, manage the team. Mauricio de Bengochea did it great in Dominican Republic. He managed all the campaign and coordinate the teams. Fundamental in this time to work with the main strategies that trust in your work and give you the guidelines, the goals, and objective. This is fundamental in this time. And the other point, counter the attacks, the digital war. We are in the misinformation and troll center era. Be prepared for the digital war. In Dominican Republic, the last 2 years, we built the digital community of the actual president, Luis Abinader, day after day, post after post. So when the pandemic occurs, we had a real and strong community that made that we were better prepared for it when the pandemic occurs. Also, you must be ready for the fake news and for the attacks. You must train your team for the worst. And the last point of this pandemic time that we did, relational organizing. The objective is spread the word of your candidate in order to get the people go to vote for him or her. Make well a structured digital organization with clear functions for each role, a specific goal to each organization's role, because volunteers will work as ambassadors of the candidate in their own circle. Thank you, Matt. I think that these points are the main things and digital campaigns in this pandemic.
Excellent. Thank you, Carlos. Now let's turn to our third speaker, Dan Constant. As a communications and media consultant and founder of Constant Communications, former president of the American Action Network and its sister super PAC, the Congressional Leadership Fund. In 2017, Dan was named by Politico as one of DC's go-to ad gurus. Now that's a title we'd all like to see on our business cards. Be really good for helping us generate new business. He's worked with Senators Marco Rubio and Jerry Moran and Representative Peter Rockstrom. He also has done, as you'll find with most of us, the immersion of the political world and the corporate world. And he's also on the executive committee of the board of directors of the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington. So Dan, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the pandemic, and then we'll turn to some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I am actually the current president of Congressional Leadership Fund, which is the House Republican super PAC. So, I think first to speak to that, CLF this cycle was actually the single largest House super PAC in American history. We raised over $160 million. Our sister organization, American Action Network, raised well over 50 as well. So in total, despite a very challenging environment with the presidential campaign, with the Senate overhanging, and with a pandemic, we were able to raise upwards of $210 million this cycle, and that money went to pretty darn good use. As of this past Tuesday, CLF ended up, so far we've won 35 and only lost 10 of the key races we played in this cycle. We were the single largest spender by a good bit in the House elections, besting the Pelosi super PAC, House Majority PAC, by a decent figure, and it worked as well. Of the 22 key races that we spent $3 million or more in, we've won 17, we've lost 2, and we have 3 outstanding. And I think of those 3, we feel very good about picking up 2 of 3, potentially all 3. I think as we look to the pandemic as it came, I think the initial thing that created a real sort of pause and a real concern was what it would do to fundraising, not being able to be on the road the same way, as Ashlee had mentioned. It turned out that we were able to adapt, and we essentially broke every record. Not essentially, we did. So we were able to work through that, and we found that interacting with donors, certainly in a pandemic, they understood that it needed to happen via phone and via Zoom. And, we were still able to establish those same types of relationships and communicate our plan, which made a big difference. I think another thing that we faced early on was an issue of indecision and sort of uncertainty. As the pandemic hit, it wasn't quite clear how this would have an impact, how long it would be, how much of an impact it would have politically. And it was, it ultimately, forced us to sort of hit pause for probably a month or so, and ultimately lay down our first media reservation, maybe 30 to 45 days later than we would have originally. That said, I mean, beyond that, it mostly many of the things that we would have done and the investments we would have made are quite similar. The places where it really forced us to evolve, and I think all for the better, were in a few places. One, we hit pause on a field program, but then we ultimately found a way to move forward with a field program that was COVID safe, but still allowed individual voter contact. And I'm proud to say we had over 450 walkers in over, I think it was 12 districts across the country. And not a single one of them got COVID. So we knocked on literally in the millions of doors, and we found ways to do it safely. On top of that, as the pandemic hit, that fundamentally changed what was going to happen in terms of how people voted. This was an unprecedented time. You had all of the sort of historical data that you would assume you have in terms of absentee vote and early vote and election day vote kind of got thrown out the window. And I think a lot of campaigns dealt with this differently. I think the parties, to some extent, dealt with this somewhat differently. But I'll say just for CLF, we knew that investing in getting ballots returned was an important one. So we ultimately put in place a $5 million ballot chase program. That ballot chase program, between mail and text messaging, I believe yielded some pretty serious results. Particularly, we focused on low propensity Republicans in non-presidential states. We also focused on sort of ticket splitters in presidential states. But we're quite glad that we conducted that program. We think it had a lot of success. On top of that, I think the message somewhat changed a little bit as well, and not fundamentally. It was still, for us, it was very much sort of what I would say meat and potatoes economic issues, the key economic drivers that matter to people's lives, and what we thought the Democrats' agenda would do to that. But on top of that, certainly defund the police ended up playing a big role. But going back to sort of the economic issues, the fact that Democrats were willing to put forward tax hikes at a time of a pandemic, I think was something that we were able to add into messaging and make it a good bit more potent. And there were other examples in terms of healthcare as well. So it sort of ran the gamut. But ultimately, when we got to the end of this, our decision to invest in field where Democrats didn't, our decision to invest in ballot chase, where I don't believe there was a significant effort on the other side. And then our ability to raise literally the most money that any House super PAC in American history has made a pretty critical difference here. And now we're looking at significant gains in the House, where Democrats were expected to pick up close to 20 seats. A lot of prognosticators and organizations around town made a big bet on Democrats, and ultimately, we had quite a night, and it's looking like Speaker Pelosi's majority is rather thin, and that's going to be a real challenge for her for the next 2 years.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. Ashlee, I want to turn back to you, and we'll ask you some questions, and then we'll open it up. I'm curious, obviously the U.S. Chamber dips its toe into the water in the deep end of the pool, and you're involved in all 50 states. How did you, as the Chamber, navigate, early voting and dealing with the absentee votes? And I mean, it fundamentally changed. It changed how you engage with not only your members, but also with the broader American populace.
Sure, that's a great question, Matt. And it's not one that just we faced alone, but every campaign, every organization needed to take into account The adjustments across almost every single state, whether it would be changes in laws to requesting an absentee ballot and an extension to return them. And even the last couple of weeks, there were some major Supreme Court rulings in 3 to 4 states that ultimately had an impact on how long ballots could be counted after election day. So first and foremost, really managing expectations with our members and those most engaged with our program to continually explain and educate that this cycle is going to be unlike anyone we've worked through before was really key for us from a communication standpoint internally and with the full business community membership of the chamber. Second to that was continuing to build an advocacy program that adjusted to these changes, making sure, and this was tough to do this year, that you were spending as early as possible. We set out the start of the year spending earlier than the chamber ever has in an election cycle, with major investments last year in a number of Senate contests, and expected to have most of our spending done through the summer and quite frankly, maybe be done by Labor Day. And of course, we all know that the pandemic changed the cadence of spending for almost everybody, particularly on behalf of the business community, where we couldn't be out during the time of the pandemic like we planned to be on the air with messaging that had already been produced that frankly would have been a bit tone deaf given all that the country was going through on so many levels. So we took into account all of those dates and rules as they were changing and engaged appropriately at a time when we thought it made the most sense for our own program as early as we possibly could, depending on where the states were with dropping absentee ballots in the mail and in the return process. And then of course, when early voting started. So I think for everybody, it was a lot of education for their own members and donors. And then your tactical execution had to be built around all of what was happening across the map, and with some of it moving day to day, if not hour to hour.
Fascinating. All right, Carlos, I want to turn a similar question to you. So that the presidential election in the DR concluded roughly a month before the US elections, right in the same as the US, right in the headwind of COVID. How did you and your team, which were on the winning side, how did you adapt? What did you change from what your original assumptions were?
Thank you for the question, Matt. I think that the first thing I mentioned it before, it was the main strategies was always talking with us, giving us the information and the guidelines. I spent really a lot of time investigating the kind of content that we can use to connect with people, because it's true that we spent the last 2 years building the digital reputation of the president. So we have a really active community. We make a lot of dynamics through the content in Instagram or even in Facebook with the community, and the community talk with us. So in this thing, it was good for us because we were preparing this thing. In the other side, for example, I spent a lot of time investigating and talking with all my team. For example, one of the things I did, I asked for all people I knew related with the campaign, of the digital campaign, send me the 5 best contents that you love during this week, not related with politics. Because I realize we cannot talk always in the way as politicians. So we need to break this distance between citizens and politicians in this pandemic when the people are worried for other things. So we investigate all kinds of contents, trying to conceptualize and to apply in the main strategy. I think this is one of the best things that we did it, because we got to break this politician way to make the communication, and it was really good. Also, one of the best points that I think the campaign did, it was one solidarity road, that it was helping the people, the citizens, without no logos, no everything of the candidate, just for the real thing to help people. So the authenticity of the candidate, it was good for the campaign.
Okay, interesting. So Dan, I got a really interesting question from the audience. They wanted to know, they wanted to hear more about your ballot chase activity. Was it a unified program in all of your targeted districts, or was it, basically the framework of a unified program with specific race nuances?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was a bit of both. So in non-presidential focused states, I'll use Oklahoma as an example. Oklahoma 5, we had a very competitive House race there. The central premise in a what they call an orphan state or an orphan district, where the presidential is not playing out above the race in a competitive way. Obviously, the presidential race existed there, but not seriously contested in Oklahoma. We focus predominantly on low propensity Republican turnout. So the first thing, there were sort of 3 steps, well, a couple steps to this. In terms of tactics, it was about a 7-piece mail program. And each time a mail piece hit, you would have a text message hitting as well. Text message with link either to the mail piece or to an ability to go get your ballot, to request a ballot, or encouraging you to return a ballot. There was also a live caller component of this. So sort of 3 components to it in terms of mail, text, and phones. In terms of the broader process, there was a lot of time and attention given, based on the modeling that we had already done in a district like Oklahoma 5, but similar ones, to focus on getting Republicans that would potentially return ballots or potentially consider mailing in their ballots to actually request a ballot. So first it was focused on requesting a ballot. Then as we moved them into the process, it was focused on getting those voters to return a ballot. Within sort of the program itself, like in terms of copy, elements of it were focused on, say, linking the candidate to President Trump, given that this is focused on low propensity turnout. In some places, it was also focused on social pressure. Democrats in your area are voting, and you are the one that that can make up this gap. One thing within this that we actually were able to utilize differently because of the pandemic, but we utilize QR codes on the mail pieces. As they had them, the QR code would go connect you to where you could then request a ballot. So between the mail, the text, the phones, and then sort of working on getting ballots requested, and then an all-out effort to actually get them returned. That was the majority of the program. There was a slightly different program in presidential states focused on ticket splitters. That message was certainly a little bit different, but I think the basic framework was not all that different.
Okay. So Ashlee, question to you about polling. And it's more just, how did you react? I would assume that the U.S. Chamber had private polling, which, as we've heard from our kickoff panel today, was far more accurate than the public polling that was out there. What efforts did you do to keep the broader business community engaged in some of these states? I won't choose one, there are a number to choose from where either it showed a Senate candidate getting soundly defeated where he or she wasn't. So what methods did you have to do to keep the spirits and the enthusiasm high among the broader business community, not only to stay engaged, but that the data was just not accurate?
It's an excellent question, Matt, and one that I suspect many of us are going to be asked for almost every day leading up to the next election cycle. I certainly was asked every day as a pollster after 2016 why we could trust internal data and the differences. You could answer this over the course of probably the next 3 hours, but I'm going to give a very short, distilled response to your question. First and foremost, the difference between the public research that we see reported on the news, particularly some of what's executed by the outlets, is significantly different from a methodology standpoint than what is conducted by internal pollsters. If you are somebody who conducts research for campaigns and gives guidance to make not just $1 million, but in the $100+ million sets of decisions made this year, If your numbers aren't accurate, that's going to be a real business problem for you going forward. So those who conduct research for campaigns and organizations understood that 16 was a bit of an issue. And it frankly started well before that, when it became more difficult going back into the early 2000s to get people to just answer traditional telephone polls. That's why we've seen so many great adjustments to incorporate mixed modal research technology, a host of different things. That said, and this is to reiterate my point earlier about absentee and early voting, it's a constant education issue, particularly when you have members and donors who want to be sure that their investment is worthwhile. I've spent 15 years, more or less, writing about public polling as it's come out to assure those, whether they be clients or organizations I'm working for, that perhaps the data we're looking at may not be great for one or several reasons, depending on the outlet and how the research is conducted. So you could really carve out a whole career at this point, writing about some of the public polling we've seen and explaining what went wrong. And I expect to see a lot of political science papers doing just that. We were constantly telling our members that the data we were seeing was different than what was being reported externally and in the public. There's no better example of this than Maine, which was our top US Senate, one of our top political priorities. We had several on the Senate side, and consistently saw this as a jump ball race. And during the coronavirus pandemic, seeing Senator Susan Collins leading at that point, because she was really, I thought, the gold standard, and not only delivering for constituents, but communicating that back. So it was a hand-wringing process to have public poll after public poll coming out being wrong compared to what we're seeing internally. But any good strategic program sets goals, builds a research campaign around it to help you achieve those goals, and you believe in what you're looking at. And you know, in a year like 2020, it was going to be turbulence, unlike most of us even are used to in what is already a tough business. So we kept our head down. We assured our membership that things were going, we thought, in the right direction. Remember, public polling is a snapshot in time. It's not a predictive forecast. And we were pleased to see her not only avoid, in the Maine example, the ranked choice balloting, but get stronger as the final votes were counted. So there's going to be a lot of postmortem on the public polling. I certainly hope that the news outlets and others who report on this take it seriously and don't report every piece of data that's released as complete fact.
Great. Carlos, let me turn to you real quick. I'd like to hear more about, well, I have a couple of questions, but I'll deal with the first one first. We'll come back to my second one. So I'd like to talk about how you integrate artificial intelligence and things of that nature into the digital that you do, because I'm fascinated by that in terms of, are you looking at consumer attitudes and behaviors? You know, you just mentioned that you would ask people to send you their 5 most intriguing non-political ads during the week. I mean, look, we get so tunnel visioned into thinking about what are the issues and how do we want to portray our candidate. But normal people look at this issue from a much broader perspective, and how are they going to put food on the table for their family? What's the new show on television that they're watching? Are their kids getting educated in school, et cetera? So how does artificial intelligence make what you do better, or more able to put the messages that resonate most with voters on their computer screen or on their phone?
It's a real good question, Matt. First of all, I think that in each campaign, you must really invest in platforms and in technology. You have several platforms for it. And after that, it's not just only the digital knowledge, it's also the data that you have of the polls and these kind of things about the behavior. In the case of the artificial intelligence, we work with some platforms that it's, they have machine learning to learn more about the different audience. Even you can do a different test with the copies, with a specific content, and depend the reaction of the audience, you are starting to learn more and more about them. Nowadays, the intelligence is really advanced on that. So it led you really to make a really like micro-targeting, I told before, for this different audience. And it's the thing that I told you, we cannot just see these things about what is related with politics. You mentioned it, you must know what they like, where they go, what they do. So there are a lot of several variables that you can know about these different audience to understand that. So in these kind of things, I say, it's not just the data, it's how do you work with the data that you have? Because these platforms give you the information after you must to structure, to organize, and to interpret. And this is the most important thing, I think. After that, I told you, with all this knowledge also, when you work with the platforms, you use these programmatic ads that you can do tests continually, and you can measure what is working, what is not, and make the change that you need to improve everything, to impact the voter. So I think it's really advanced, all the technology that we have nowadays to work on it, and learning more and more. And everyone have his different platform that they prefer. The thing that I say, work with people really experts in this area. With the sociologists, psychologists, is what I'm trying to tell you. We have a really big team with different disciplines. And in the campaign, actually, Mauricio make different experts of different areas. So we work each one together to try to improve the results. So it was not, I make the content. There were other people specializing in the programmatic, other people specializing in how to manage and build the better communities related with the campaign. So it's the thing I told you. I think that you must really work with these specialists, and after debate. I think this pandemic time in the campaign was a time to debate about the data. Because maybe I have my report and I say other company, other partner, hey, what do you think about that? How do you feel it? So it's think out of the box, share the information with your colleagues, trying to really see the best way in the digital thing.
Great. Thank you, Carlos. All right. So Dan, I have to ask you a question ultimately about Donald Trump. You were clearly successful in shrinking what was the blue wave to barely a blue ripple. But I do have to ask, so Donald Trump, as we've seen consistently, has a nasty habit of stepping all over his message. And I think that the challenge became especially true with the pandemic, where, as we said, I've often referred to it as the third candidate in the race. And it seemed to be closer to Joe Biden than it was to Donald Trump in terms of influencing how people voted. How did you deal with the president's statement about the pandemic in your targeted House races? And was that the issue that moved voters, or did you swing back to the economy? And I know, we've heard Ashlee talk about the business community. Having done a lot of work in California, a lot of people were less focused on the pandemic and more focused on, why aren't my kids in school, and why aren't my businesses open, and why aren't the businesses open? So I'd just be curious to know how you dealt with a president that is literally by choice in the news every day and making statements that are fairly polarizing with the overall election climate.
Yeah, I mean, we look, as a super PAC, we're in a little bit of a different situation than a candidate. We don't really have to answer for folks in our party or respond to news of the day. I mean, we have the benefit of really being able to sort of put forward the message that we want to. I mean, and we felt like, and it was consistent in our polling, that ultimately the sort of driving issue was going to be jobs in the economy. I think, frankly, the pandemic, it certainly didn't help, but it did for many people reinforce the importance of an economy that needs to come back to life, and sort of core economic issues of, okay, well, we're in this now, so what's the best path forward? And we focus very much on that. And I alluded to this briefly early on, but our message in terms of taxes, in terms of, frankly, even healthcare, where we were able to sort of flip the script on Democrats some and focus on that we had multiple Democrats who supported Medicare for all, which would closing rural hospitals in the middle of a pandemic. Would be a really sort of terrifying and concerning thing. Same idea in the Biden tax cuts or tax hikes, that ended up being a central message for us, the $4 trillion tax hike. So, So from a rhetorically, I mean, we very much kept our focus on the economy and jobs, and then I think as defund the police came out as an issue and it evolved, we found a pretty useful way to message that. Ultimately, we found that and I think the president's campaign was right in that a lot of their vote was motivated by sort of focus on the lawlessness and the liberal mob. And we found that in the districts where we needed to really turn out similar type voters, that was very much the same message. But in suburban districts, we found that this really need to be a message about public safety. And a message about public safety was, well, what are the consequences of less police? Longer waits for, when you need help the most in terms of 911 wait times, less safe schools, less safe parks. So we very much focused there. And then tactically, I mean, we did put in place a big focus on getting ballots returned. And ultimately, we will find out in a matter of months, once like the actual vote records are back, who ended up voting absentee early, in person. But just based on the overperformance of House candidates that we can see so far, I think it did work for us. I just want to quickly go back to something Ashlee said as it relates to polling, and I think she hit the nail on the head that ultimately, like, we use polling for the wrong reasons. I think we know that polling is really good as a strategic device. It's really good as a directional advice. It's sometimes not great as a predictive device, and too many people sort of focus on just using it as a horse race thing of, well, what's the number today? And this we do this every cycle, and it's sometimes it's very difficult to actually judge turnout. There's a lot of ways you can judge sort of which way the race is heading, and ultimately how you get from A to B to C to D to victory. But sometimes it's just not it's not working for predictions. And some of our polling was dead on, and it was I think all of our polling strategically was very useful. Some of our polling was dead on from a prediction standpoint, and elements of it needed sort of missed turnout universes. And I think, like, ultimately that's something that the polling community we're probably going to have to work on with the polling community. And this isn't a specific pollster issue. I think it's a real challenge out there trying to peg turnout with a lot of different electorates.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, we've got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions. You can either answer them one at a time or together. So what did you learn during this campaign that you will use again in the future? And also, what do you think that you did that was only applicable during a pandemic? Ashlee, I'll turn that over to you first.
Sure, that's a really great set of questions. So the first is, when you're a political strategist, you think about always being nimble enough to adjust on a dime if you need to. It's something that those of us who work in political strategy probably say all the time when we talk to donors and clients and things like that. 2020 is a year that really held us to that. So your ability to be able to pivot as necessary to achieve your ultimate goal, which most of us was win on election day, I think that this really proved those who have the ability to do that. And 2020 is certainly a disruptor cycle. As I'd stated at the top of the call, we always knew it was going to be a disruptor election, because not only was it going to be such high anticipated turnout, and of course resources flowing into these races like we never expected before, but the inclusion of absentee and early voting paired with the inability to really do in-person events, which is important for our own program, forced this to look under the hood at everything that the chamber has done historically, particularly from our endorsement process, where we would spend a lot of time and money, frankly, on the road doing in-person endorsement events across the country, because we know this generates tangible earned media, especially for those Senate candidates that we were backing this year. So I don't know if we'll continue to operate in the same way with spending just so much time and human capital out traveling across the country, when we all have learned from a finance standpoint to an endorsement standpoint to campaign update calls, you can do all of this virtually and frankly save people just a lot of time getting back and forth. I think it's going to be really fascinating to see how the finance community and fundraisers to continue to adjust. 2020 was just so amazing, and what happened in the final months of the election from a record-breaking standpoint on both sides of the aisle. I'm really looking forward to after action reviews to see who did what and who did it really well, as clearly some campaigns did, and if the pandemic sort of forced everybody to increase their capabilities on digital. And I'll leave it with digital. We've known for a long time that this was the future, going back to as most recently as whenever President Barack Obama built an incredible digital infrastructure in his 2007 and 2008 campaign. And it took a long time for some folks to catch up with that and believe that digital was not just an add-on, that digital wasn't something that just, quote, paid for itself. If anything, this put the speed on, or the gas on the pedal on digital, even more and more effectively to be able to use it for whatever your goal is. And I look forward to seeing that to continue to be a part of the playbook in an even more expanded capacity than it was prior to this election cycle.
Carlos, let me ask you the same question. So what do you think you'll use in the future? And what was something that you think is just a one-off because of the pandemic? And I would be curious to know how you will apply it to races in other parts of the world where you work.
Well, I think that the technology, it's depend the country, because not all societies is in advance to use it. About the first question, we learned that nothing is static, less in the digital world, and that the landscape can change at any time and suddenly, and we must be prepared to face these changes. Something very important for us, it was the importance of the social media to connect with citizens. We knew that before, as Lee mentioned it in the last campaigns, but now we have a really advanced platforms. We talk about the artificial intelligence too, to know this, because we must think that now people, the most part of time, maybe they are at home. Sometimes isolated, maybe they feel alone, they feel sad, they feel angry. So the way to connect with them, we were thinking always about the algorithm. For example, we say sometimes that some people make his real opinion of the war through the algorithm because they are reading this information in Facebook or maybe in Twitter or other social network. So always we were thinking how to arrive to this algorithm. We must now sum that how they feel it. So if we think how it's changing the things, I think that we must think too in how to connect with them, and that we must be careful the kind of content and the messages that we really do it correctly. About the first thing. About the second thing, I think that we must talk about the voice assistants. I think that when we think about how it's changing everything, we must know that the behavior of the people, now you are asking a lot of things through your voice. You talk with Siri, you talk with Alexa, where is this place, how I prepare that. So I think that some things that we are going to see soon, it's different campaigns with the voice strategy. I think we must think on that. And there was one question that they asked in the chat about the technology. I think that we must never forget that it's not about technology, it's about people. So you need the specialists to know how to interpret all data, because it's not just the machine learning or the artificial intelligence. It's important to have these tools, but don't forget this. This is a tool that you are going to manage to get your objective in the election.
That's why they hire people like us, so that because we know the technology, but we also know how to make it work in the right ways. So Dan, let me turn that over to you, ask you the same questions, and then panelists, after Dan answers, we'll go to the speed round of concluding thoughts because I've just been given the 4-minute warning. So Dan, what did you, just to make sure you're, what did you learn that you'll use again in the future, and what you think was a one-off that was just unique to the pandemic?
Well, I'm hoping management by Zoom briefing is just a one-off. And I think it will be, which did prove to be a challenge. Now we got in a groove, but ultimately the difference of what you can do in person, I think is meaningful. I do think the changes in how people vote will continue. I don't think that is a one-off situation now. I think you'll see continued more absentee, more early, less election day vote. That lengthens the campaigns. It did lengthen our campaigns, although, we still spent the vast majority of our resources in October. And since so many House races ultimately broke late, I think we feel vindicated very much by that. But it does make it more complicated. So I would imagine that, pretty extensive individual voter contact plans of not just persuasion, but how you get people to request and return ballots, and when you do it, is going to be a pretty significant piece of this. And I didn't really speak to our digital efforts at all, but I do think, one of the things that we really made an enormous investment in this cycle was streaming devices. Given how many cord cutters there are, but given how many people were sitting on a couch, we ultimately invested more just in Hulu than we had on any streaming platform total the cycle before. And Hulu was just one of the networks that we were on. Though one thing I'll just, I saw a question here. Do you agree that there was a similar bias like in 2016 of underestimated Trump vote? And I think that is clearly the case. Certainly there is whether it's a hidden Trump vote or sort of a shy Trump vote. I think it is more that there's a certain group of the electorate that's just not answering poll calls. I have a harder time believing that people are sitting on poll calls for 10 or 20 minutes and just not telling the truth. But I think that there are parts of the electorate that were just missing. And we saw it, the president underperformed in the suburbs, which is, we knew and sort of had been preparing for, but in many of the other places where we were running races, it's as if his numbers didn't drop at all. And I do think, that is some piece of this overall sort of why you see the public polling consistently so off.
All right. Well, thank you, panel. I think that we're not going to get to the concluding thoughts portion of the conversation, but I think that you all have really added some really deep insights to a recently concluded election year. I'm going to conclude by urging all of those who are on this panel and those who are watching to, if you're not a member of the International Association of Political Consultants, our conference was supposed to be in Miami this year, and like the election, the COVID kind of got in the way of that. We will be returning to Toronto next year. We will have fascinating speakers from all over the world. And the conference is awesome on Zoom. It's even better in person because you get to engage more directly with the people that are talking. So that's one thing that I know will be better about the conference next year. But again, if you're not a member, we would love you to join. You get to talk to some really smart people and learn from them, which is always fun. So with that, I will thank you again and look forward to having you stay with us for the rest of today and tomorrow. That's it. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.